I thought this was a great way to sum up Lisa, from Seth Godin. He says, Lisa Gansky, like Al Gore, didn't invent the internet, but she co-created the first commercial website, developed the idea of advertising online, created online photo sharing and printing, and sold companies to both Kodak and AOL. Most importantly, Lisa gets it. She sees around corners and describes a future that seems impossible until you realize that it's imminent. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you Lisa Gansky.
I'm very truly excited to be here because of the work that you do. It has so much import in terms of what's happening with respect to the mesh and some of these trends. And so I'm really going to be trying to minimize as much as possible some of the examples in my talking and allow you guys to ask questions, and hopefully we can have a conversation. But please also feel free to stay in touch afterwards, because I think, I think there's quite a number of intersections. So let me just jump in by saying that the mesh is really a fundamental shift in our relationship to the goods, services, and talent in our lives. Last century was organized around ownership, the aspiration to own things as individuals and as businesses. And now what we're seeing is that we're living in a world in which access to goods, services, and talent trumps the ownership of them. It's not always, but this is fundamentally about the pursuit of better things easily shared. That is, that we're going to start to and continue to design things intended to be shared. Flexibility, durability, multiple users, thinking hard about materials and how the afterlife of materials, a la Bill McDonough. And we're going to figure out also systems, services, business models, partnerships, private and public, to enable the sharing of those products. Sharing isn't new to us. You know, we've obviously lived in a world where we have many examples of sharing. This is I don't know if you can all see, this is a train in France, a cafe in Sao Paulo, more stuff coming into San Francisco from a friend's office, one of my favorite bus designs in Helsinki, and this is what I refer to. All sharing starts and ends with the mother of all share platforms. And I think it's also, at least as we start to think about the mesh and what it means, really important to think about, well, why is it happening now? What makes this relevant today, and why do you really think it's happening today? Well, first of all, 10%, there was a study done, many studies, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with a lot of the statistics floating around. At the end of 2010, there was a study done that basically said in 1900, you know, this is historic, 1900, 10% of the people on the planet lived in cities. By 2050, 75% of the population of the planet will live in cities. So density, urban density, is fundamentally one of the main drivers of the mesh. Lots of people in the same physical space, unless we're willing to trade on quality of life severely, means less stuff. Secondly, the sort of stress or various facial expressions and other things that we've all been invited to do as a function of the economic downturn, the recession, the depression, the economic shift, whatever you want to call it, it's fundamentally, again, caused us to, both in our personal lives and business lives, reevaluate and realign the true cost of things with the true value. And then this is a shot I took in, I refer to this as, this is rush hour in Copenhagen. Climate change also has caused us in businesses as well, and design of cities, thinking about mobility is one aspect, but certainly the built environment, water, all sorts of things, food. And then another vector here is trust is on the wane, that in the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of the big brands that in the last 50 years became, like they were, Jonathan was reading about Kodak in my bio. We've been hearing so many things about many of these companies that have been around for 50 or 100 or 131 years, in the case of Kodak, that have been either arrogant or asleep or basically very greedy, and have caused many of us to really wonder why we trusted them. Whereas historically, brand equity was something that people gravitated to and were willing to pay more for. In this case, now we're starting to see people really questioning what it means. You know, what's the big deal? I'm paying more for something and these guys are basically ripping me off. What that's created is a really interesting other opportunity for entrepreneurs and for trying new things, because people, there's a crack in the armor and people are much more receptive to consider something from someone they haven't heard of, or the use of a material maybe that they haven't seen before. Maybe they're willing to take a little bit of risk where before they weren't. And then lastly, we are more connected to more people on the planet today than ever before. If you're sitting next to them, that may not be the case, but theoretically we're more connected. So if I was making a soup or a cocktail of how to make the mesh, it's essentially the social networks, meaning this. It doesn't just mean Facebook and LinkedIn and the electronic social networks, but the Design Council is a terrific example of a social network that's fundamental to the mesh. Mobile computing, the little device that most of us have to have pried from our hands, in my case, you know, it's a kind of remote control for life. It has GPS. We're able to walk around, get off of a plane. It knows where we are. We can find restaurants, people, buildings, all sorts of things. So as my friend Clay Shirky says, the city becomes legible in a whole new way. And that really sets up for a moment in which access trumps ownership. And then lastly, physical goods, whether it's GPS or RFID or other sorts of technologies, we are able now to really successfully track things moving through time and space. Additionally, we know, and I'm sure everybody in this room could teach me many things, which I'm hoping that will happen too, is that the sensors, you know, the cost of sensors is really going so low, is approaching zero. And the size of the sensors are going so small that the opportunity is to put sensors in many places to have a lot of data about where things are in time and space and what's being used and by whom. That also opens up some interesting possibilities. So let me put some meat on the bones. An example, how many people here have ever used a car sharing service? Okay, great. And how many people here have heard of Zipcar? Right, super, thank you. So an American company, Zipcar, went public last year. Zipcar did not invent car sharing. Car sharing was invented 40 or 50 years previous to that in Europe. And car sharing was essentially done at a very local level, in some cases hyper-local. You could informally share your neighbor's car, run next door. There was, in some cases in community centers, boards and things where people would swap keys or make things accessible to people that they knew when they weren't using things. And then when the founders of Zipcar actually went to Switzerland, one of them went to Switzerland, she discovered car sharing really could be a little more sophisticated than that. So they did a little research. They went to Montreal. At the time, this is, you know, probably 14, 15 years ago, in Montreal there was essentially a blackboard on a wall, you know, not super high tech, but same story, you know, calendar, who has access, which cars, those sorts of things. And they thought car sharing could be really cool, it could be really compelling, but it will never scale when it looks like this. And so they started to define how will car sharing work. And they figured out that one of their primary best targets in the US, where we love our cars, are students, college students, because you have high density. You have high density of people that generally don't have cars, or didn't in those days. And then you also have the ability where they have driver's licenses, because it was very of the day to, of course, have your driver's license straight away. And they felt that they could also figure out a membership program, make sure it check their driving record, make sure that the insurance coverage was there through the company, et cetera, and make these cars accessible campus by campus. So that was the original focus of Zipcar. And they had some really clever other things. They made some really important decisions. They marketed with ads like this that said things like, if you can't see it, 350 hours a year having sex and 420 looking for parking. So marketing was definitely one of their strong suits. They also didn't pick ex-cop cars. You know, they had these sexy little, the new Beetles and little Minis, and they picked nice cars that were aspirationally interesting to run around and drive. But I don't think that's why Zipcar is winning in the world. I think they're winning because they understand that they're not in the transportation business. They understand that they're in the business of information, and that when you and I interact with their cars, I get a smart car to make a fast commute. I get a four-wheel drive to go to Tahoe with my family skiing on a weekend with a ski rack. They start to learn patterns. They see what sorts of behaviors different communities and even different neighborhoods have. And they're able to start to share that information potentially with different partners back to you again, and continue to inform manufacturers of cars, other sorts of people like the Department of Transportation in cities, how to connect up these services so that they make sense, so that we actually take the friction or the speed bumps out of the intersection of car sharing and other sorts of mobility services. And so, but initially they basically understood that in order for this to go from a blackboard in Montreal, it needs to actually have a strong infrastructure and a strong technology as its primary foundation. And so data is essential, and the understanding that in some cases, in some of these mesh businesses, and possibly in parts of your business, the data about the product or the project may be actually more valuable than in some cases the project or the product itself. One of the main tenets of the mesh, which I want to delve into with you today, is value unused is waste. That is, if I look at my garage, and I'll confess, you know, a kayak and 3 bicycles and a bunch of stuff that when I go in there I scare myself, is largely sitting around. I'm here talking to you, and those things aren't walking around, you know, downtown Napa. So, but the same is true also on our balance sheets. There's factories, and having worked at Kodak and now the news of Kodak, you know, factories and intellectual property and all sorts of things that we value that sit on the asset side. Actually, if they're not being used, I would say they're probably for sure being wasted, and in that way may be a liability. And so the opportunity here is to start to identify where you have value unused, because in fact that's waste. When we look at cities, when we look at our you know, daily practical life, we start to see that there's an opportunity to, we're all familiar with this little sign, but I'm starting to see the world in a way where something like this can be put on nearly everything that I own that has value, that I am willing to actually allow other people to access. And so there's nothing really except for the fact that does anybody here remember cable-ready television? Or do you remember network-ready computers? Right. That's as silly as walking out with your mobile phone. You know, who has an iPhone and doesn't have a service? So one of the things that I think we're moving to is cars are going to be connected. Houses, to the extent that they make sense, or homes will be connected. Machines are going to be connected. There's a connected world in which when you put a little sensor on something, suddenly you have availability visible to others outside of yourself. And so just to give you some reference point, in 2000, Zipcar launched the service. It took them 6 years to get 1,000 cars actively in the service. In 2010, a company called Whipcar, a peer-to-peer car sharing company in the UK, which basically allows neighbors to share their cars together. Took 6 months to get 1,000 cars in network. So the peer-to-peer phenomenon essentially comes from, in the case of car sharing, the two things that really work for car sharing is, and the main thing is, you have to have a car that's 1 to 2 blocks from where you are. So if you tend to, when you're at work, you know, you arrive to work with mass transit, and occasionally you have to go rather far for a meeting outside the city. You know, the ability to borrow somebody's car in the building where you work, rather than have to drive that day specifically for a 1-hour meeting, those are the sorts of things that they started to uncover. People are willing to share cars in all sorts of situations. And in general, most people are willing to use a car share service if they can walk 1 or 2 blocks and find a car that's available. If you have kids and strollers and child seats and all those other things, it strips the buzz from car sharing, and it tends not to work very well. But there's certain demographics that, for whom in moments of time it's not right. But my point in showing you this is it's a wonderful example of saying this is where we convert waste, unused value, my car sitting right now in front of my house or my office, to real value for someone else. And for me, because, for example, in San Francisco there is a service called Relay Rides. The average person who's in the service is making $300 to $500 a month renting their car to their neighbor, you know, metaphorically their neighbor. And so this is a strategy, the peer-to-peer economy, or something that many people call collaborative consumption, is taking off. It's taking off as it relates to kids' clothing, vacation homes, private cars, private jets, private buses, parking spots. Parkatmyhouse.com just got funding from BMW. So this is happening. It's happening all over the world, and I'll tell you more later. But one of the main tricks here, as we start to think about this, and especially for those of us that aren't just coming out of college, and we probably own stuff. We have stuff, and we probably like it. And for most of our lives, at least, we grew up in a world in which we were marketed to want to go buy things, to own them ourselves. And so one of the real challenges when we look at the access-based services is how do we make sharing irresistible? You know, we have experiences of sharing being irresistible in some aspects of our life, but it's hard to imagine how you could scale this and make it into a business. Another thing, when we start to look around cities and look for where there's unused value, is when we think about this phenomenon. I'm sure many of you are instigating, if not at least familiar with pop-ups, pop-up galleries, pop-up stores, pop-up gardens, farmers markets, etc. The whole pop-up phenomenon is an identification of something that's not being used immediately, or it's sitting in some, not getting full use, and now you're going to convert it to, you know, there's a really successful project in Oakland, California, near San Francisco, where a group of people whose restaurant went under in 2008, really talented chefs, super connected. They had all these relationships. They decided that they would kind of bring together these artisan makers. You know, they make preserves or bacon or whatever they were making. They brought together a bunch of people that they thought were really, really talented. And they made like a little food gallery as a pop-up general store. And they did it once in a while, and now that's basically grown into a really successful business that, you know, line out the door, it's kind of like the buzz to even know when it's happening. So there's a lot of these things going on, and I'm guessing, have many of you heard pop-up restaurants and pop-up stores? And yeah. So this is an example of one that I think is taking an old business model called rent commercial space and turn it into something that's meshy, where there's a turnover. This is a store that's basically in Glasgow Airport called the Plane Shop, and it's essentially what they do is every month they simply change the one manufacturer or brand that's in the shop. So this month they may have Jimmy Choo shoes. they go really deep. Jimmy Choo gets to use it as an opportunity to reach new markets, to get feedback on products they haven't launched yet. If they're thinking about moving into a men's line or something else, they get to get out in front of people inexpensively, rapidly, and start to mess around, get the feedback, and then use that. But the next month, these guys will be off doing the same thing for Starbucks or Virgin or Adidas or someone else. And so in that way, you know, it's just a really interesting, I think, business model in which it allows us to rapidly iterate and be in front of a commercial audience. One of the themes of the mesh is essentially, you know, people often go for serious perfection, and waiting until something, it's the ready, aim, 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 now don't bother firing because the target's moved kind of thing. And I think one of the things, at least from certainly being a digital entrepreneur and an entrepreneur from Silicon Valley, is there's a lot of forgiveness for making mistakes, and there's actually a culture that supports making inexpensive and rapid failures. And so I'm just sharing with you the screw it, let's do it, put it out there, let's get some feedback. Obviously you don't want to do that with a high-risk project in a big moment, but it's just a way of saying, you know, there's opportunities for us to start to play with something, to kind of do a raw, low-cost sense of a little prototype and get some feedback and start to play with ideas in ways that, that allow you to move forward, or also, alternatively, to kill projects early. Some of the platforms that are emerging to do this are things like Beta 620, which is an internet-based platform that says, you know, use our relationship to try stuff to companies like the New York Times. And so the New York Times, you know, I'm sure we all are somewhat fans or at least familiar with the Times, and like most publishing companies are going through quite a struggle. What they have done is basically said, we know that people value our brand, we know that people value something about what we do. What are people willing to pay for, and what are people willing to, unwilling to pay for? You know, we know that they value like the news, but are they willing to pay for that? But we know for sure that we get tons of feedback and actual requests about, would you people please make a crossword puzzle app? You know, I'm sitting in the airport, I would love that. I'd pay for that. So they put up their different ideas. This platform allows them to regularly, any product manager, take immature ideas and put them out there to let people make facial expressions digitally, you know, get engaged, give feedback, say that they'll buy it, get on a list, or maybe even take out a credit card. And so these sorts of platforms are really rich, and in many cases, this is kind of a very structured version of what a lot of people call crowdsourcing, which may or may not be something you're familiar with. Crowdsourcing is the idea that you put something out and you want people who are outside of your company or organization or project to give you ideas, feedback, thoughts, and that you're then going to do something with it. And many companies have actually grown up in the last 5 years cultivating really strong brands and communities as a function of creating people who actually do their design who are outside of their own company. And so I can give you some examples. Bill Joy, who is a very famous, and still is, a very famous engineer and entrepreneur in the Valley. He's a founder of Sun Microsystems. He used to say that the best people, the smartest people who are the best at working on whatever problem or project you're focused on don't work for you. And so how are you going to seduce them and engage them to be a part of your solution? And so this is a company designed by a guy who loves designing products, but he was frustrated because while he loves designing products, he's not a business guy, and he wasn't terrific at necessarily figuring out the best business case, or he would fall in love with his product ideas before they necessarily had a market. And so he created this company called Quirky. And the whole idea of Quirky is there's lots of people out there who are, it turns out, there's lots of people out in the world who have really cool product ideas, or at least they think they're really cool. And so what these guys did is they invited and have kind of curated and wrestled a rather large community, global community of product designers, professional and amateur, to give them all sorts of ideas and to respond to product ideas that they put up that they're thinking about working on. And what I like about Quirky is that, like all of us, if we're working on a project, or if our brand, our personal brand, or our company's brand is at risk, we don't want to necessarily take whatever crazy ideas 300 people that we don't know come up with, because that's kind of an invitation to a mess. So what Quirky does, which is quite clever, is they put it out there, they let people give them all sorts of ideas, and then they get together as a team and they pick 2 ideas a week, and those ideas go through a product analysis cycle to determine, is the market big enough? Is it interesting enough? Is the competition too severe? Are we too late? Is this the right design? Could we get it at the right price point? How many would we have to make for us to pay for the first run? All these sorts of things that the quants work on. And then they come back to the community and interact with the community about where it is in the process. So they are very transparent with those people who actually are part of the Quirky world. And they have created really interesting things like, remember that silly thing that we plug, the power strip, you know? So for years, I looked at that and cursed it, because as the power supplies got bigger, the seduction of putting 6 into the thing was complete, right? Nonsense. Because maybe we could get 3. And so this guy graduated RISD and said, you know, he was annoyed to the point where he said, here's a design. And this is called pivot power. There was 803, maybe 5, I might have the number slightly wrong, people in the Quirky community who participated in the design of this. Each one of them gets a little royalty. They get their name on the product. The product is sold in all sorts of stores. Like if you go into an office supply store, you know, one of those big office supply stores like Best Buy and Target and places like that, they'll sell these things. So this is just an example where you can take the voice of the community, and they've been very good at putting it out, using crowdsourcing to get lots of ideas, and then curating and triaging through those ideas and going back to the community and engaging so people feel that they're part of the process, but you're not putting your whole brand and your whole business strategy in the hands of people you don't know. And so one of the big things about the mesh is to engage people, to create platforms, to inspire communities of people's participation. And essentially, for me, platforms are invitations. And there's has anybody heard of Kickstarter? So Kickstarter is, this is one that's called Ulule, that's in France. There's about 9 or 10, maybe even 11 in Brazil today. There's 5 or 6 in France. There's probably 60 of them around the world like this, and essentially what they are is they're crowdfunding platforms where communities of people can decide that they want to support a project, or they want to support this product being made enough that they're willing to kind of put their money in escrow. So for example, this one says, the Hibu, it's a short music film, it's 1,200 euros. So if you watch the video, you read their story, you think they're brilliant, and you really like what they're doing, you could actually decide, you could put in 5 euros or 20, or if it's in the case of my nephew did a project on Kickstarter, so 100. You know, you basically give them your credit card, it goes through and sits until they get at least 1,200 euros. If they get 1,195, the project doesn't go. Bless you. If they get 1,200 euros, the project goes, and the platform usually takes about 5%. So that's the way these crowdfunding things work. So for product design, this, I like photography. This is, do you know this thing? Have you seen it? So I got one, of course, because I'm like a 5-year-old. It clips onto your iPhone over the lens, and it essentially gives you a fisheye, a wide-angle lens, and another decent general lens that is better than, better than sort of the standard iPhone lens. And what's really interesting is these guys now have their own company, that launched it on Kickstarter. But the really big example, which I really got a kick out of, is, I think I brought it. Hold on. Yeah. So this guy he might actually be an architect, but he had an idea. He's definitely a runner, and he was frustrated because his iPod Nano kept falling out of various pockets and things when he ran, and he was really annoyed. So he designed a watch to hold the Nano. And then, he figured out that it was going to cost so much money, he didn't want to do a crappy watch. So he designed a really cool one. But he had to basically sell $15,000 worth of the watch in order for him to be able to have the watch he wanted. So it was a totally selfish endeavor, which I'm all for that. He put the video up on Kickstarter, and he accidentally sold $975,000 worth of the watch. It's now being sold in, I've seen it all over the place, but it's called TikTok. I can pass it around but it's really nicely made. They spun out a whole company just like the Olo clip. And so we're starting to see these things where, people are using, in a way, there's just other sources for checking. Before I go, it's an interesting community-driven version of what we used to call OPM, other people's money. This is a way in which you can say, here's my story, I'm doing something, I'm creating a community garden and I'm pitching to my community. Or, I'm pitching to a community of runners or photographers or whatever. And so you'll see if you have a few minutes and you have the interest, actually while I'm remembering, because I'm not really an author and I struggled with even thinking about writing the book, and I'm a geek, I built a database. And the database was 1,200 companies that do this meshy stuff around the world in 25 different categories. And it's evolved into about 6,000, and it grows every day. There's lots of people doing it. So if you go, the website is meshing.it, like Italy. I can give it to you later. But I think you might be interested because there's a lot of examples there that will give you some chance to explore beyond this conversation. This one is another flavor of crowdfunding or crowdsourcing, depending on which side of the transaction you're on, I suppose. The company is called Innocentive. It was actually started inside of Eli Lilly, and they started it because they said, we have a lot of really smart people here. There's a lot of problems health problems in the world. We know that the people that are working on things like, the cardiology folks are really smart about nephrology and probably also really smart about type 2 diabetes. We think all our research shows that we should be doing something about this. The people who are already working on diabetes are already working on it. Probably there's a bunch of really cool ideas that are going to come from people who aren't working on that, but they're in our company. And this is a really interesting way for us to extend retention and other things by giving people a chance to work on and solve problems that they're interested in, not just what they were hired for. So this had a lot of success in Eli Lilly. It spun out as a separate company. And now you'll see what they basically do is they put up a challenge. And they say, we'll put $100,000 or $1,000 on someone who comes with something that we judge to be the solution for this thing. So whoever puts the challenge up gets to be the judge. But there's quite a lot of activity and enough that this company is getting some very serious recognition and funding. So then I look and say, well, cities are platforms. Cities are inviting. we have a long history of interacting with cities in ways where we kind of use it as a canvas. I mean, even those of us who aren't architects. And then when I really like the logo, but essentially it's to say, you know, one of the things about platforms is that they need to be open. And how do we start to look at cities in ways that we can open them up for communities and for designers, and expanding potentially even the team or the definition for who's a designer. Key to that, as in many instances, is data. And so several years ago, Google actually put somebody on, or they put themselves on, I'm not sure which, creating a programming interface, an API, for transit data. And what that did is that came coincident with a lot of the cities and the municipalities basically not having the money to create applications or to do interesting things from the Department of Transportation. And so what happened was, if the city was willing to let my people go, let my data go, if the city was willing, the Department of Transportation was willing to let the data go, suddenly what they discovered is there were at least tens, if not hundreds, of developers who were really interested in creating really relevant applications with that data. And again, if we look at mobility as an example, to go from your house to car share to mass transit, the speed bumps that are now there as a commuter could be really lessened or removed altogether with things like this. And so I think you're probably very well aware, but there's many of these applications, as well as programs like See-Click-Fix, which is an application where basically citizens report when they find potholes or when they find lights that don't work or things like that, graffiti, and the reports go into the city, so it keeps the city from having to discover and verify because photos are sent along with the report. It actually makes it much more efficient and much cheaper for the city to manage a lot of these things. And so I tend to look at nature for a lot of inspiration. Waste equals food, for me, is very fundamental, and I really like this example, which is essentially Electrolux, a company from Sweden, who understood that their customers who were mostly women, apparently in Europe, and very concerned about the oceans. They actually, from their Electrolux lab, came up with this idea, like, why don't we pay people to go collect plastic on beaches around the world? And then we'll donate that money to those organizations that organize the cleanup. It'll be the community or whatever, nonprofit organizations. But then they want to actually use the product, the waste, literally, to create a product that has real value. And so they created these. These are actually recovered plastic that they don't try to make look like something else. And I actually really love them. I find them, I've seen many photos of them, and no two are alike, of course. They have a lot of value because no two are alike. They're a collector's vacuum, but I'm only kidding. But and so this is a great example of turning waste into value, but also really doing that for their brand as well. For me as an entrepreneur, one of the things that the mesh offers is this music of define, refine, and then scale. Most of the, and again, don't have to tell you, but most of the cost and most of the risk and most of the scary stuff comes when you go to scale, not when you're playing with little models and ideas. But all of the evidence is that if you can iterate very rapidly and inexpensively and with a community of people, define and refine multiple times, many multiple times before scaling, produces a really extraordinary result. In some cases you might kill a project, but in other cases you may end up with 6 new products or ideas that you didn't have before. And so for me, this is really one of the fundamental pieces of the mesh, along with the unused value equals waste. This wasn't me a few years ago, although I'm not aging well, no. This is just to say that when we started Ophoto in 1999, we raised $60 million in funding from venture capital. When I was writing the book, I decided that I would take out the presentation that we used to raise the money because of all of these services that are available. Are you familiar with SaaS, software as a service? So the cloud and all that. So that really has changed so much for so many people. But that's not all. It's also that there's talent spread all over the world, not unlike in this room, where we now have these networks of people, really rich networks, where we can reach out to people in non-trivial ways and have really effective conversations and mutual projects. And so as I looked at my old numbers of why I justified raising $60 million, I had to ask myself, what would it cost me? What would I need to raise if I was starting Ophoto today? And it was $3 to $5 million. And it's a decade later. So, the whole capital structure, last century was the generals, General Electric, General Motors, General Dynamics, General Mills. Those all required a lot of infrastructure. We can do so many lean, fast, inexpensive things right now. And so I'm inviting you to embrace that perhaps in ways that you haven't, and also to hopefully include me and us in your conversations as you start to discover more things, because I think there's really, really interesting opportunities, especially when we start to look at the design of cities. So in terms of a little springboard for how to think about it, data, again, really, really key, both because it's informative for today, but also the idea that there's going to be sensors or little collectors of data in different parts of the world or city or home or building that can continue to inform all sorts of things, even if it's just used at a prototype level when you're designing something. There's real opportunities to start to include data in increasingly interesting ways in the design and in the implementation process. Examples for cities, the London Data Store. London has actually opened up a lot of their data. As a city, they've done it well beyond transportation, looking at crime, some health, many other, they seem to be extremely responsive. I think, this is this may be a couple months old actually, I think they were just cooking up a new website. So the thing is that many cities are jumping on here and continue to expand what they're making available. I know that in the US, the Health and Human Services part of the country, basically that reports to the Secretary of Health, is very radically and aggressively opening up health data, not the private part, but more the kind of clinical trials and the information that you would get if you actually had all the data from the VA hospital, the Medicare and Medicaid, and what that would actually allow people who were designing elder care systems or cities for that matter, or playing with the future of medicine. So a lot of these things are really inviting. They're running, they're very funny there. They're running data paloozas, which are basically inviting a lot of geeks and doctors and designers and all sorts of folks, community members together to have design conversations, looking at what other data could they make available and what would happen if they did. This is one, and this is a new project. Full disclosure is I'm actually an advisor to this guy. He was the global head of sustainability at Tishman Speyer in New York. And after making some progress there, I think he concluded that he could make more mischief outside. So he started Honest Buildings, which is somewhere between like a nutrition label for buildings, a community, and a kind of Zillow, but showing different information. And so what this is there's ways, if you are in all these categories, to participate. But if you were to go to the home page, you could see that it's rapidly spreading around the world, and you could look at a specific building and it tells you how much per square foot to rent or to buy, and what, whether they have energy efficient lighting or energy efficient HVAC, and parking situations, and what they support from a sustainability perspective. And the main point is that around the world, the message has consistently been that those buildings that are more aggressive on this side of sustainability are doing better from a financial perspective. And so that's the whole, his whole interest is to create more transparency across the sector. For me, one of the big things with the mesh and the opportunity, certainly as we look at cities and the world, but in any instance, within a company, and I've been in several as you all are, people tend to be willing to broadcast successes, but sometimes failures not so much, at least for me. And I'm not going to do it now either. But I have to say that some things that I've been watching lately are really interesting and encouraging. That, being an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, for example, some of the culture is want to be generous and to be disclosive. That people train me as an entrepreneur by making facial expressions or telling me not to do that or taking me into meetings where I probably shouldn't have been. And then as soon as you kind of do something that works out well, there's a kind of built-in code that says you should turn around and do the same for someone else. And so a lot of the angel investing wasn't so much because you thought you were going to get rich on your friend's idea, but more that you were extending yourself. And I think that one of the things that we're starting to see in cities around the world and with increased connectiveness and transparency is that people are and projects are getting shared very rapidly. And so, for example, bike sharing, which now is the fastest growing form of personal transportation on the planet, with more than 300 cities doing bike sharing. This is Velib, which was launched in 2005 in Lyon. It was launched at a fairly small scale there relative to 2 years later when it was launched in Paris, so define, refine. They launched in Paris with 20,000 bikes in 2007. All sorts of things happened. Generally, people were excited. It got a lot of press. They looked really smart. They figured out a creative business model. They made a cool bike. A lot of things really worked well. Some funny stuff happened. Some people threw the bikes in the Seine. Some people vandalized the bikes. One thing I really like is that if you do a topographic map of Paris, there's hills and valleys. Well, it turns out, not surprisingly, that there was kind of a collection of bikes at the end of an evening near a bistro on the bottom side of the So now they run like the Velib Sweep, which is a truck that comes around and just in case somebody doesn't have they may end up putting a battery on those things. But one of for me, the important thing is that we are sharing very rapidly, and no one has had to repeat version 1.0 of bike sharing, that we're learning from each other because these experiments are taking place kind of like many of your experiments where everyone can see them at some moment. And so, this is really a terrific example of how the world has moved pretty rapidly to continue to iterate on a design and ideas that work, so that Boris Bikes or Barclays Bike Hire in London sat on the shoulders of Velib 2.0. And so I think that that's a really also important piece. It also is very fundamental to reducing waste. So that's the theme of paying it forward. And then lastly, collaborative innovation. There's a company you may be familiar with, IDEO. They basically do fabulous work, I think. They generally do work for clients who can pay them. And so one of the guys, Tom, who is in London office, had the idea, why don't we make something like Open IDEO, where we take some of the things that we know how to do well, and we make them available for free so anybody can start to implement them and use them in social settings in ways that make a difference in the world. And they got all excited, and there was like however many people there were in the room, they were like drinking lots of coffee and high-fiving each other, even suspend disbelief. I know they don't really do that in London, but and you know, they got very excited though. They just were very sure that they were onto something, but they stopped themselves before they got too far building out this thing that they weren't sure whether or not anyone else would care about as much as they did. And so they did this really fast and simple thing, which was essentially they put up a Facebook page and they put up some ideas. They say things like, how will climate change change your life? Or what happens when people, can't even read his writing.
Live.
Oh, thanks. Live way beyond 100. Thank you. So, so those are the sorts of questions. People voted on which questions they wanted to see explored, or maybe they put some answers. If there were questions that no one interacted with, they changed the question. They invited other people to change the question. One of the main things with IDEO, like for most designers, is everything starts with a good question. So they were very detached from the questions and actually detached somewhat from the whole process. They had an enormous and immediate engagement with this Facebook page. And so it was so positive that they then went ahead and actually did open IDEO. But this was, I think, a really good example of a really inexpensive way to test the idea and refine it before going big. This is an example of Eco-Magination Challenge. Eco-Magination is a brand created by GE. They essentially use this because I think they understand that they're big, they don't move all that fast, they really want to be in renewable energy, they really want to be, they already are in the home and in renewable energy, but they want to be pretty aggressive about, in general, the whole category and moving the category along faster. But also, they realize that they're known for many things, but probably right now not for innovation, and certainly not in this category. So they took to heart this whole notion of the best people to work on this aren't necessarily currently employed by you. And they created a challenge where they gave away $200 million for companies that came up with solutions or products for addressing basically energy efficiency in the home. They gave the money out. Some of the companies they've reinvested in. I believe they've bought 2 companies subsequent to this. And this is a sort of platform that they can repeat. They can continue to do this on a regular basis and expand it into other categories. It's just an interesting way for them to stick to their brand and still have the ability to curate what gets in and who gets supported and all these sorts of things. But it allows them to cast a very wide net and to bring all sorts of characters into their fold. As an entrepreneur, companies like that are scary because we have no idea how to deal with them. We don't know what door to go through, who to talk to, how to talk to them. So this also creates a really interesting door and interface. So my takeaway message is essentially this: blow some stuff up, try a few experiments. I think that learning early and learning fast and learning inexpensively and trying things, I think we're extremely early in something that's going to fundamentally change the way work happens, the way that design happens, and the way that we live in communities. And so I would just invite you to start to play. This is a quote from a guy who, William Gibson, who is a famous sci-fi author in the geek community, which is essentially, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed.